A lot of people in Canada are liking becoming our beautiful, cherished 51st state.
Those are the infamous words that ticked Canadians off and led to what's being called Victoria's best tourism season ever.
In terms of top-line revenue and hotel metrics, this is by far a record year.
Canadians spent their tourism dollars in their own country, skipping travel to the United States.
President Trump thought he was cracking a harmless joke. He glanced at the crowd earlier this year and tossed out the line, "A lot of people in Canada are liking becoming our beautiful, cherished 51st state." But something unusual happened. Canadians didn't laugh. They didn't shrug it off. They didn't roll their eyes and move on. Instead, they quietly reached for their wallets, changed their travel plans, and delivered one of the most unexpected economic messages of the year. Victoria, British Columbia, is enjoying what tourism officials describe as the best season in modern history. Meanwhile, across the border, U.S. towns that normally rely on Canadian travelers are reporting shocking drops in traffic. Trump wanted to score a political point. Instead, he triggered a consumer revolt that is now rewarding Canada and punishing the United States. The entire story pivots on that now infamous 51st state remark. It came at a time when tensions between Ottawa and Washington were already simmering. Trump's second-term America First agenda has pushed tariffs on Canadian goods higher than at any point since the 1980s, and diplomatic patience on the Canadian side is running thin. So the comment didn't land as a joke, it landed as an insult. And Canadians reacted in a way that even U.S. tourism officials admit they didn't anticipate. They stayed home. They skipped cross-border shopping trips. They canceled sports weekends. They held on to their Canadian dollars and spent them in Canada. CTV's reporting out of Victoria captured the shift perfectly. Local hotels hit record occupancy levels. Restaurants filled. Ferry terminals were jammed with domestic tourists. One tourism official put it simply, "This is by far a record year." Across the Strait of Juan de Fuca, the tone could not have been more different. Ferry operators who usually shuttle Canadians to Seattle watched their passenger numbers collapse by roughly 30 to 35%. Port Angeles business leaders said they were so worried about the drop in Canadian visitors that they organized welcome back campaigns just to try to slow the bleeding. Even then, many admitted that the numbers never returned to normal. The most remarkable part is that nobody coordinated any of this. No government policy forced Canadians to stay home. No political campaign urged a boycott. This was a spontaneous, deeply Canadian response. Quiet, polite, but economically devastating for the United States. And as more data rolls in, it's becoming clear this wasn't a one-month anomaly, but a structural shift in travel behavior. Tourism analysts say Canadians are increasingly choosing domestic adventures, interprovincial travel, and local experiences, partly because it feels economically responsible during a period of U.S. unpredictability. What began as a reaction to Trump's comment is gradually turning into a broader cultural reset about where Canadian dollars should stay.
The first explanation is cultural. Canadians accept a lot, tolerate a lot, and often give leaders, even foreign ones, the benefit of the doubt. But they do not like being belittled. The 51st state line crossed the line because it dismissed Canada's sovereignty at a moment when the country is debating its place in the world. Under Prime Minister Mark Carney, Ottawa is pushing a narrative of economic independence, diversification away from the United States, and a stronger national identity in trade and foreign policy. Trump's comment ran directly against that national mood, and Canadians reacted by withdrawing something the U.S. cannot easily replace: their spending power. This backlash might not have happened a decade ago, but Trump delivered that remark at the exact moment when he was raising tariffs on Canadian aluminum, steel, autos, fertilizer, and dozens of industrial inputs. Canadian families were already paying more for U.S. goods, businesses were already facing export uncertainty, and political tension was already high as Ottawa braced for the 2026 CUSMA review. When you add an insult on top of economic pressure, the response becomes emotional, not just rational. Canadians didn't just rethink their travel plans, they reasserted their dignity.
The drop in Canadian travelers exposed something U.S. border towns didn't want to admit. They rely far more on Canadians than Canada relies on American visitors. In Washington state, tourism boards publicly acknowledged losing a third of their Canadian traffic. Retailers near the border saw slower foot traffic. Even major ferry operators were forced to pivot to U.S.-only events and sports charters to survive. Meanwhile, Victoria enjoyed a thriving summer. Hotels sold out. Local shops had their strongest sales in years. The island's tourism boom became a quiet affirmation of a new reality. When the relationship sours, Canada can keep its economic activity within its own borders and benefits directly. The irony is striking. U.S. officials are now describing Canadians as essential visitors, a term almost never used publicly before. It reflects how deeply border economies depend on Canadian spending and how vulnerable those regions are when Canadians decide to stay home. Trump's rhetoric did not merely irritate people, it undermined an economic relationship Americans assumed was unshakable. This tourism story fits neatly into Canada's broader political moment, with Carney pushing a long-term plan to reduce economic dependence on the United States. Canadians are signaling that they're ready to support that vision with their own consumer choices. They don't need to shout. They don't need a campaign. Their behavior says enough. If a single remark from Trump can redirect millions of travel dollars back into Canada's economy, it suggests something important. Canadians are done being underestimated. They understand their leverage, and they're increasingly willing to use it. Washington's border towns want Canadians back. They want the hotel bookings, the restaurant receipts, the weekend traffic, the retail spending. But Canada's shift may not reverse quickly. CTV's reporting noted that many Canadians, quote, may not be back to the States anytime soon, and tourism experts in both countries expect the trend to continue into 2026. The U.S. now has to decide whether Trump's rhetoric is worth the economic damage. So far, it looks like the political theater isn't working in America's favor. Victoria's record tourism year is more than a feel-good headline. It's a real-time example of how political rhetoric can reshape economic behavior without a single law being passed. Canadians were insulted, so they stayed home. Their cities benefited. U.S. border towns suffered. And the episode leaves one lingering question. If a simple joke can push Canadians to redirect billions in travel spending, what will happen when the United States and Canada sit down for the high-stakes USMCA renegotiation in 2026? Trump joked that Canada was the 51st state. Canadians answered by reminding him they're not.
Another renewable energy source could soon be coming to the forefront in Canada. Near the beginning of November, Max Power Mining Corporation successfully drilled Canada's first dedicated natural hydrogen well near Central Butte. The company's incoming CEO says energy is like a buffet, with every sector playing its part.
Canada just pulled off something big, something that could redefine the entire balance of power in North American energy. While Washington is still arguing about tariffs, drilling leases, and whether EVs are patriotic enough, Canada quietly drilled the country's first natural hydrogen well in Saskatchewan. And unlike the usual political theater, this move actually means something. It's practical, it's strategic, and it places Canada ahead in a race most countries haven't even realized has started. Natural hydrogen, the kind generated underground by geological processes, has long been treated like a scientific curiosity. The U.S. Geological Survey has published maps showing America has promising zones, but U.S. companies haven't moved past early exploration. Canada, meanwhile, did it. A functioning well, real data, and a team preparing for commercial flow tests. In the middle of a trade war climate where the U.S. is weaponizing tariffs, pushing allies into corners, and demanding supply chain obedience, Canada just opened a door into a new source of clean, scalable, and potentially exportable energy. This wasn't just a drilling operation. It was a message. Canada is building its own future.
In early November, Max Power Mining Corporation completed Canada's first dedicated natural hydrogen well outside central Saskatchewan. The well reached over 2 kilometers deep and hit multiple hydrogen-bearing zones. For a long time, geologists debated whether natural hydrogen existed underground in usable quantities. Saskatchewan just proved that it does. The chief geoscientist behind the project described natural hydrogen exploration as a chess match, the kind that rewards patience, skill, and an understanding that the Earth doesn't give up its secrets easily. Max Power now has 6 additional concept sites ready for evaluation, with the company preparing a full round of flow testing to confirm commercial viability. The timing couldn't be more remarkable. Canada's energy system is already one of the cleanest in the world, with an 85% clean electricity grid powered by hydro, nuclear, and growing renewable capacity. Prime Minister Mark Carney has spent the past year promoting a diversified, Asia-oriented trade strategy as the U.S. under President Donald Trump doubles down on tariffs, protectionism, and demands for allies to fall in line. Now Canada has stumbled upon a resource that could speed up the energy transition, power AI-driven data centers, reduce water usage, and eventually become a new export sector. All at the moment the U.S. is squeezing neighbors with 25 to 100% tariffs and threatening new import restrictions. Hydrogen wasn't supposed to be part of the political story, but now it is.
While America debates which state should host the next oil lease, Canada is doing what innovators do, moving first. Natural hydrogen is still a frontier resource. The world has barely scratched the surface. But leadership matters. The country that proves the resource is real will shape the standards, the technology, and eventually the market. Today, that country is Canada. The United States has geological potential, but no major company has drilled a purpose-built hydrogen well to full depth. Canada has. And in geopolitics, the difference between might be possible and we already did it is enormous. Trump's second term has made one thing clear: energy and trade are now the same battlefield. The U.S. has slapped tariffs on Canadian steel, lumber, aluminum, autos, and now even trucks and agricultural goods. The message is simple: Washington wants leverage. But leverage only works when the other country depends on you. Canada developing a new source of clean domestic energy weakens that dependence. Natural hydrogen could support heavy industry, AI data centers, export corridors to Asia, or even clean fuel markets in Europe, all while reducing Canada's vulnerability to U.S. supply disruptions. It's not that hydrogen will replace oil tomorrow, but markets move on signals, and the signal from Saskatchewan is that Canada is not standing still. Mark Carney has spent 2025 building new partnerships across South Korea, Japan, ASEAN, and China. APEC 2025 made one thing clear: Asia is opening its door to Canadian energy, technology, and supply chains. Natural hydrogen fits into that pivot beautifully. South Korea just signed a defense industrial partnership with Canada. Japan is expanding clean tech investment. China wants to reset relations and is hungry for cleaner fuels. A future hydrogen exporter with political stability and environmental credibility, that is a role Canada is perfectly positioned to play. And it is a role the United States cannot block with tariffs. Historically, America dominates new energy markets. From shale oil to LNG exports, the U.S. usually moves first and forces others to catch up. But natural hydrogen is different. The U.S. has maps, draft policies, and pilot projects, but no major commercial drilling success story. Canada now holds the milestone. With Washington locked in tariff disputes, angry refinery lobbying, and political battles over environmental rules, the U.S. is distracted. Clean energy investors notice, artificial intelligence firms notice, data center developers notice, especially since natural hydrogen could dramatically reduce water use compared to cooling today's AI clusters. A Canada that can power next-generation computing without relying on U.S. gas or U.S. political unpredictability becomes a very attractive partner. Let's be honest. Canadians have taken one hit after another this year. Jeep production moved south. Trump imposed more tariffs. GM shut its Ontario electric van line. Washington has tried to use energy as leverage repeatedly. And then suddenly, Canada scores a clean tech win entirely on its own soil. No U.S. subsidy, no White House pressure, no multinational dictating the terms. Just Canadian geologists, Canadian land, Canadian innovation, and a well that may open the door to a brand new industry. For a country often framed as reacting to U.S. decisions, this is a rare and welcome reversal.
Canada's first natural hydrogen well is more than a scientific breakthrough. It is a statement of intent. While the United States leans deeper into protectionism and tariff leverage, Canada is building the industries of the future: clean energy, AI-ready infrastructure, and Asia-connected trade routes. If commercial tests succeed, Canada will not only gain a new domestic resource, it will gain bargaining power, it will gain independence, and it will gain credibility as a country capable of leading, not waiting. So the real question is simple. If this is what Canada can achieve with its first hydrogen well, what happens when the next 6 come online? Because for the first time in a long time, Canada isn't following. Canada is setting the pace.
Canada and the United States had a relationship built up over decades that the U.S. decided unilaterally to change. They didn't consult us. This wasn't a discussion, negotiation. They unilaterally changed it. We're not even going to sign a good deal. We're going to sign a great deal for Canada. And yes, we can give ourselves more than the Americans can take away.
Prime Minister Mark Carney just did what many Canadians have quietly wanted from their leader for years. He looked straight into the camera on one of the biggest media platforms in the country and said out loud what most politicians only whisper behind closed doors. During a tense and unusually candid interview with Toronto Life, Carney exposed the way Donald Trump pressures Canada, how the relationship has shifted permanently, and why this country must now stand on its own feet like never before. It was calm, it was controlled, and yet it felt like the verbal equivalent of a thunderclap. This was Carney at his sharpest, not angry, not emotional, but absolutely immovable. And in doing so, he delivered a message that resonated with millions across the country. Canada is not a junior partner. Canada is not a bargaining chip, and Canada is definitely not anyone's 51st state.
The interview landed at a tense moment in Canada-U.S. relations, with Trump's second-term White House expanding tariffs and reshaping cross-border trade. New duties, including the 25% tariff on medium and heavy-duty trucks that took effect on November 1st, have already hit Ontario's auto sector and pushed the Bank of Canada to downgrade growth forecasts. Against this backdrop, Carney sat down with Toronto Life and spoke with unusual candor. He revealed that he and Trump text directly, describing late-night messages written in all caps and the president's habit of applying pressure at every opportunity. Carney emphasized that Trump negotiates by pushing hard on leverage points, something Canada must understand but no longer accept as normal. Then came the line that has already gone viral across Canadian social media. When Carney was asked about Trump's repeated jokes that Canada should one day become America's 51st state, the Prime Minister did not flinch. His answer was simple, firm, and delivered with the kind of national confidence that stays with you long after you hear it. Never, never, ever.
We are not the state there. He wishes that we would be part of the United States. And as I said in the Oval Office when he said, "Never say never," I said, "Never, never, ever."
Carney's interview marks a turning point, not just between him and Trump, but in how Canada sees itself in relation to its massive neighbor. For nearly 4 decades, from the 1980s free trade era to the early 2020s, Canada and the United States grew closer and closer, building supply chains, integrating industries, and relying on the assumption that the border was no longer a political fault line, but an economic bridge. Carney made it unmistakably clear that those days are over. The United States, he said, unilaterally changed the relationship.
They did not consult Canada, they did not negotiate the shift, they simply imposed it. And that means Canada has to adapt. According to Carney, 85% of Canadian trade remains tariff-free, the lowest average tariff exposure of any country trading with the U.S., but the era of automatic goodwill is gone. Canada must now negotiate from a position of strategic self-interest, not nostalgia for a friendlier past. This is not anti-American sentiment. This is Canada waking up to reality. Carney is effectively telling Canadians that reliance is no longer a strategy. Resilience is. And the sooner Canada builds its own economic engine, housing, energy, AI, ports, manufacturing, the sooner it can negotiate with the U.S. as an equal rather than a dependent.
One of the most striking parts of the interview was how Carney described Trump's style without ever resorting to insult. He acknowledged Trump's skill, his experience, and his understanding of power. But through understated and diplomatic language, Carney revealed exactly how Trump operates: identify a pressure point, hit it hard, and keep pushing until the other side feels the squeeze. Carney's response is a contrast in leadership styles. Trump pressures, Carney prepares. Trump improvises, Carney strategizes. Trump sends all-caps texts in the middle of the night. Carney builds 25-year plans for national housing, clean energy, and industrial independence. The interview exposed not only Trump's behavior, but also Canada's new posture: steady, disciplined, and unwilling to be knocked off balance. And that is why the never, never, ever line landed so powerfully. Carney didn't just reject the idea of Canada being absorbed by the U.S. He rejected the mindset of inferiority that Trump's rhetoric relies on. It was a sovereignty moment, one that reminded Canadians of the quiet strength embedded in the national character. Beneath the political tension, Carney tapped into something deeper, a sense of national pride that often goes unstated. He pointed out that Canada is one of the most admired countries on Earth, a place people choose, not a place that needs validation from any foreign president. By highlighting Canada's diversity, stability, and social generosity, Carney reframed the conversation away from Trump's bravado and toward Canada's values that cannot be traded, bought, or bullied. This is why the interview resonated so intensely. It wasn't about attacking the U.S., it was about defending Canada, and doing so with the confidence of a country that knows exactly who it is.
Carney also used the interview to outline his long-term vision. He described a country preparing for the largest nation-building era in a generation. 65,000 new homes in Downsview, new transit links, massive clean energy projects, a national industrial strategy built around AI, and partnerships across Asia and Europe to reduce economic dependence on America. This is not rhetorical flourish. This is a plan shaped by necessity. As U.S. tariffs become more unpredictable and global rivalries intensify, Canada needs to diversify, innovate, and build, not react. Carney's comments make it clear that Canada's future strength will come from its ability to chart its own path rather than follow the gravitational pull of American politics. Carney's interview was not a spectacle. It was not a rant. It was the opposite, a calm articulation of sovereignty at a moment when Canada needed clarity more than comfort. By exposing the pressures from Washington, naming the reality of a changed relationship, and reminding Canadians of their own national identity, Carney delivered one of the most important political messages of his premiership. The question now is whether Canada can move fast enough to match the scale of this new era, to build the housing, energy systems, technology sectors, and trade partnerships that will secure its future. Trump will continue to apply pressure. The U.S. will continue to act in its own interest. But Canada, for the first time in a long time, seems ready to respond on its own terms. And after watching Carney on that stage, one thing is clear. This is not a country that bends. This is a country that builds. What if Canada decided to strike back in the trade war, not with steel, autos, or lumber, but with something far more dangerous to Donald Trump's political survival? Eggs and poultry. For years, dairy products have been the classic flashpoint between Ottawa and Washington, a sector where Canada's supply management system, with its tight quotas and sky-high over-quota tariffs, has blocked American producers and repeatedly triggered Trump's anger. If dairy can spark presidential outbursts and trade threats, imagine what would happen if Canada applied the same pressure to U.S. eggs and poultry, a sector even more politically explosive for Trump. This is the weapon almost nobody talks about, except the people who matter most to Trump: farmers, processors, and rural voters across the U.S. Farm Belt. If Ottawa ever turned its supply-managed egg and poultry system into a trade counterstrike, the impact on the United States would be immediate, deeply political, and impossible for Trump to ignore. Because in the U.S., eggs aren't just food, they're votes.
The world has become more dangerous and divided. Many of our former strengths, based on our close ties to America, have become our vulnerabilities.
To understand the stakes, we need to zoom out and look at the political map of 2025. Trump is deep into his second term, leaning heavily on tariffs as his go-to negotiating tactic. Canada, under Prime Minister Mark Carney, has avoided retaliation so far, choosing diplomacy while expanding trade ties with Asia. But behind that calm exterior, Ottawa still holds unusually sharp leverage thanks to its supply management regime, a system that controls production, restricts imports, and legally shields entire sectors through quotas and high over-quota tariffs.
It means that our economic strategy needs to change dramatically and rapidly. Above all, we will build Canadian. We'll be our own best customer.
We have a supply managed system in Canada, which is just as the name suggests, it's managing supply. We introduced it in 1972, and it's Canadian production for Canadian consumers.
Eggs and poultry sit inside that framework, just like dairy. And this is where the what-if becomes explosive. The U.S. poultry and egg industries are not just economic pillars, they are political fortresses. Their geography overlaps almost perfectly with Trump's electoral base. Iowa, Georgia, Arkansas, Missouri, Ohio, Pennsylvania. These are not just farm states, they were the backbone of Trump's coalition. That's why agricultural retaliation has always been Washington's nightmare. When China targeted soybeans during the 2018-2019 trade war, the shock almost derailed Trump's standing in the Midwest. If that was the impact when the adversary was Beijing, imagine the pressure if Canada, a friendly neighbor, disrupted access instead. The economic scale alone makes the hypothetical serious. The United States produces roughly $57 to $60 billion worth of poultry and egg products every year. A significant portion of that output depends on stable export markets to prevent domestic oversupply. And Canada, because of proximity and reliability, consistently ranks among the top buyers of American processed eggs, yolks, and chicken cuts. So if Ottawa ever slowed licensing, recalibrated quotas, tightened inspection windows, or simply shifted allocations toward non-U.S. suppliers, all fully legal under WTO rules, American producers would feel the consequences almost immediately. Supplies would back up, prices could soften. Rural counties might start questioning why the White House provoked a response it wasn't prepared to handle. This is why the scenario matters. Eggs and poultry are Trump's blind spot. They touch not just the farm economy, but the electoral core he counts on. Canada wouldn't need dramatic action. Its supply management structure already offers subtle but powerful tools. Imports are capped by quota, and anything above that threshold faces steep, often prohibitive tariffs. Ottawa administers these quotas with considerable discretion, adjusting timing, pacing, sanitary reviews, or allocation priorities. Even modest changes could shape real-world outcomes. A slight slowdown in licensing during peak U.S. production could create bottlenecks. A shift in quota allocation could favor European or Asian suppliers. An additional inspection requirement could delay shipments just long enough to unsettle markets. All of this would be legal, incremental, and fully consistent with the way Canada has historically defended dairy access during past U.S.-Canada disputes. For Trump, the political cost would be immediate. Governors in poultry-heavy states could accuse Washington of mismanaging trade. Farm associations, among Trump's most loyal supporters, would demand clarity. And rural voters, who already faced price shocks and disease-related disruptions in recent years, might see any loss of export access as needless turmoil triggered by Washington's tariffs.
Trump might ignore retaliation in sectors like lumber or aluminum, but he cannot ignore agriculture, because agriculture is his political oxygen. Every rural rally he holds reinforces the message that he is the defender of American farmers. If Canada were ever to tighten poultry and egg access, even symbolically, it would immediately test that narrative. America's domestic food economy is fragile. Inflation remains a central complaint among voters. A shakeup in poultry and egg markets could raise prices for consumers, even as farmers face falling export income, the worst possible combination for any president. Meanwhile, media in the U.S. would amplify the story. Did the tariff war backfire? Why is Canada hitting American farmers? Is Trump risking his base? The political pressure would be intense long before any formal trade action escalated.
While the exact figures would depend on the severity of Canada's action, existing agricultural data allows for a realistic estimate. USDA numbers indicate that Canada buys roughly $700 to $900 million USD worth of American poultry, eggs, and processed egg products annually, across all related HS categories. If Ottawa reduced access by as little as 15 to 20% through slower licensing, preference shifts, or added sanitary reviews, U.S. producers could hypothetically lose around $100 to $180 million per year in direct export revenue. Because the sector runs on tight margins, the knock-on effects could push total losses into the $250 to $300 million range once oversupply, domestic price drops, and inventory write-downs are factored in. Those numbers are small relative to the U.S. economy as a whole, but massive inside the rural counties that determine American elections. And that is where the real danger lies for Trump.
For Canada, the fallout of such a hypothetical response would be limited. The country is largely self-sufficient in eggs and poultry, and domestic producers would quickly fill any gap. Consumers might see minor fluctuations, but the overall system would remain stable. The greater risk would be political, the possibility of provoking Washington into reopening agricultural chapters of USMCA, but that risk already exists under Trump's escalating tariff strategy. And that brings us to the heart of the matter. In trade conflicts, the most powerful weapons are often the quietest ones. Eggs and poultry may seem unremarkable, but they underpin the politics of rural America. If Canada ever chose to use this leverage, the hypothetical fallout in the U.S. Farm Belt could be significant. Shaken prices, anxious producers, pressure from governors, and a wave of criticism from the very voters Trump depends on. For now, this remains only a scenario, not a prediction, but a warning. Because in the US-Canada trade standoff, the next decisive move may not come from factories or forests, but from something far smaller and far more politically explosive, the humble egg.